In the second in these series of videos exploring character and sense and sensibility, we're going to move on to that dizzy, romantic, idealistic Marianne. As with the first video, you'll be asked to do two different things. Firstly, to pick out 5 key moments which feature Marianne within the novel, and then 5 key quotations. You're going to get all of my analysis, all of my detailed insight, and it's going to be incredibly useful. So stay tuned and watch Schofield on Shakespeare. I'm afraid that you do need to do something when watching a YouTube revision guide. Magic won't just happen. So here's the first task to get you thinking in more detail about Marianne. Consider her role in the novel and write down 5 moments in what she does, says or thinks is important to you and or interesting. No need to use quotations, just summarise each moment in a single sentence using your own words. So press pause now. The video will resume in 5 seconds time. And here's my list. First up, Marianne is in disbelief that a woman can have any feelings or respect for someone who can read Cooper's poetry so placidly. Next, unsurprisingly, is the moment she takes advantage of the rain to sprint down a hill with younger sister Margaret, only to twist one of her feet, leaving her unable to walk. Thank God for dark brooding, turning up at exactly the right moment, Willers. My third moment explores her defence of her, shall we say, unconventional one-to-one trip to Allenham with Willoughby. Any list must include that excruciating moment when Marianne catches sight of Willoughby at a private party in London, only for her passionate addresses to be formally snubbed. And finally, I want to explore when an ashen-faced Marianne learns that actually she isn't the only person who has suffered in recent months. It's just that Eleanor has aimed to think of others in a way which never occurred to her. So let's explore these 5 moments in more detail. This extract is taken from Volume 1, Chapter 3, and comes following a discussion between Marianne and Mrs. Dashwood about the probability of Edward marrying Eleanor. Press pause to read this through now. Of course, the pair are talking about Eleanor, but actually what Marianne says tells us far more about herself than her elder sister. Perhaps unsurprisingly for a 16-year-old, she is an idealist when it comes to relationships and marriage. She wants that perfect, romantic, quasi-spiritual connection and union. She feels that an appropriate partner should exude emotion at appropriate moments, which must include when reading the poetry of the 18th century popular poet William Cooper. We're not told what poem he was reading, but here's a flavour of Cooper with the first 2 stanzas from one of his most famous poems, The Poplar Field, from 1784. The poplars are felled, farewell to the shade and the whispering sound of the cool colonnade. The winds play no longer and sing in the leaves, nor ooze on his bosom their image receives. 12 years have elapsed since I last took a view of my favourite field and the bank where they grew. And now in the grass, behold, they are laid, and the tree is my seat that once lent me a shade. There is a sense of melancholy and loss in this poem. A series of trees have been cut down, resulting in the loss of the calming whistling sound of the wind blowing through the branches, the loss of the shimmering reflection of the trees within the river Ouse. The poem goes on to make a connection between the loss of these trees and the persona's own mortality. Life is all too short with perishing pleasures. Cooper wrote numerous poems describing the countryside, and it is clear that Marianne not only shares this love and passion for the natural world, but has no time for those who don't appear to appreciate it fully. She is genuinely astonished that Eleanor seemingly did not mind that Edward was able to read such passionate, beautiful poetry in such a dispassionate way, and even has the gall to feel some pity for her. There are two key implicit points to take from all of this. Firstly, the idea that emotion needs to be displayed to exist, and secondly, that all relationships need to follow the same narrow guidelines and principles. The experiences of the novel lead to Marianne realising late on that both ideas are wrong. So these lines confirm that Marianne is a vibrant, passionate individual who lives to feel. Cooper's poetry has frequently almost driven her wild. As far as she is concerned, being inspired and guided by your emotions is the way to properly live life, and those who don't are implicitly inferior. Time now for my second moment. Yes, it's that stuff of schoolgirl fantasies. Being rescued by the dark, mysterious, oh so good-looking stranger. This extract is taken on the same day of the rescue. Marianne is questioning Sir John about the man who unceremoniously carted her back to home and hearth. Press pause to read now. Following Sir John's characteristically indiscriminate enthusiastic praise, anyone who hunts and isn't obviously in-your-face rude is liable to be described similarly. Marianne is visibly delighted to hear about Willoughby's energy and life. She is clearly someone with fixed, narrow views about what people should be like. If you're going to take part in something, you should do it wholeheartedly and with unbounded enthusiasm. Whilst this is certainly a good principle, there are hints here of naive, unrealistic extremism in Marianne's perspective. Should there really be no moderation whatsoever in someone's hobbies? For instance, what about the effect of these pursuits on others around them? Is it right just to consider the self without taking into account the wishes of others? And how realistic is it to dance non-stop for 8 hours without feeling tired at all? So essentially, Marianne here is sounding like a typical teenager. She thinks she knows it all, but ultimately she is channeling an unhelpfully narrow, dictatorial vision of how the opposite sex should be, when in reality there are so many other, equally natural and apt ways for men to behave. Rachel Brownstein prefers to view Marianne's sensibilities in a more positive light. She puts her idealism within the context of a novel in which individuality is sorely lacking, meaning that, for instance, almost anyone can make up the parties at Barton Park, and that Lucy is able to seamlessly switch her affections from Edward to Robert Ferrars without much fuss beyond initial gossip. Particularly within the world she inhabits, and particularly given the absence of possibilities for women beyond the domestic sphere, perhaps we should laud Marianne for her blind determination not to compromise on her romantic principles in the early parts of the novel. Third moment. Colonel Brandon receives a letter which forces him to leave for London at once, meaning that the planned expedition to his brother-in-law's house and grounds at Whitwell has to be cancelled. Sir John proposes that they drive about the country nonetheless. Willoughby and Marianne shoot off, and are discovered later to have visited Allenham, his aunt and patroness Mrs. Smith's residence. In this extract, Eleanor accosts Marianne about her impropriety. Read it through now and press pause. I earlier described Marianne as a typical teenager, and there are further signs of this here. Her two questions, highlighted now, are petulant, characteristically defensive, and miss the point. Doubtless Eleanor may have some curiosity about the home which their charming newest friend Willoughby is likely to inherit. But she knows that such curiosity cannot be satisfied at the expense of propriety. Like it or not, in Austen's world there are strict rules for men and women, particularly women. Failure to follow these rules can lead to dangerous speculation and the potential loss of a woman's second most important asset beyond her fortune, her reputation. Maggie Lane goes into more detail about other prohibited behaviour within her book Jane Austen's World, and points out that this visit to Allenham is not a one-off. Marianne has persistently ignored the rules of her society, bringing her perilously close to losing her honour, which would make her unmarriageable and a social pariah. This is exactly the fate of one of Willoughby's earlier conquests, little Eliza, as Colonel Brandon reveals later in the novel. Willoughby had presumably gone one step further with Eliza than he did with Marianne, and had sex with her. And interestingly, in Joanna Trollope's largely dreadful modernisation of the novel, Marianne and Willoughby do have sex in the equivalent section. Eliza's subsequent pregnancy results in her complete ostracisation from society. She subsequently has no creditable home, no help, and no friends. But crucially, there doesn't need to be a pregnancy for there to be a loss of honour. Pure words and gossip, pure speculation can be enough. But at this stage of the novel, Marianne takes no heed of Eleanor's warnings. Indeed, she doesn't actually understand what propriety is and naively equates it with an innate sense of what is right and wrong. She feels that human beings instinctively know whether they are acting in an improper way, whereas the truth is that propriety is an unnatural social construct, albeit guided by some common moral principles. At this stage of the novel, Marianne has a fixed mindset and doesn't want to listen or learn. Moment 4. Marianne has been waiting, yearning, listening, hoping throughout all her time in London. And one evening it finally happens. She sees Willoughby once again. Read through this extract and press pause. We can see throughout this scene how Marianne is incapable of showing restraint. She is in public, surrounded by many tens of strangers, yet she speaks to Willoughby exactly as if the two are meeting alone in private. The two superlatives show the fervency of Marianne's also open emotions, whilst her oaths, good God and for heaven's sake, show just how unsettled and astonished she is at the coldness of Willoughby's reaction to her. She uses frantic open imperatives demanding answers, which are not directly answered. Instead, Marianne is left to infer her rejection through Willoughby's body language and rigid formality, leaving her broken. What we are seeing here once again is evidence of Marianne's naivety. Her insistence on romantic experience above all has left her ignorant of the real, practical world which she inhabits. Within her own family, it's only Eleanor who seems to have any decent awareness of financial realities, whilst Marianne has persisted in her pure belief that true yearning love is the only thing that matters. This refusal to engage with the practicalities of a world in which men have to take account of their future partner's financial status, especially extravagant ones like Willoughby, leaves her even more hurt and wounded by this rejection than she should have been. The obvious possibility that Willoughby might need to throw her over in favour of someone with money has literally never occurred to her. Miss Gray's £50,000 a year, equating to an income of $2,500, and so more than Brandon's $2,000, is not to be scoffed at. And as Copeland concludes in the paragraph on screen, this will almost certainly always be the significant bottom line when it comes to romance. Time now for the final moment. It's Marianne's long overdue epiphany in Volume 3, Chapter 1. She has just heard that Eleanor has known about the hateful Lucy Steele's engagement to Edward Ferrars for 4 long months. And actually, she's really suffered during that period, even though she's been largely successful at appearing composed. Read it through, press pause. Characteristically, we see Marianne's extremism. After learning of her own comparative inconsiderate selfishness, she labels herself as barbarous and needing to hate herself forever. Both reactions are over the top. Yes, she has, to use one of Austen's favourite words, indulged, but her age and the fact that Willoughby has clearly been a vile rat are considerable extenuating circumstances. She uses repeated melodramatic rhetorical questions to suggest that her passionate energies will now be directed at berating herself, rather than feeling sorry for herself. But most crucially, Eleanor manages to draw practical recompense out of her impressionable younger sister, so that something tangible, something useful, emerges from such genuine feelings of remorse. Moving forward, Marianne at least will try to feign, to hide her true feelings, to lie even. She will aim to repress her emotions, something which would have been anathema to her younger, undiluted self. For the novel suggests that such self-control, the maintenance of dignity and composure in spite of difficulties, is worth doing, emphatically does have value. Or to return to the novel's title, sensibility is nothing without some application of practical sense. Let's move on. In the exam, you will need to be able to wheel out actual quotations giving very specific individual insights. So it's time for your second task. Reread sections of the novel before writing out 5 quotations which give different insight into what Marianne is really like. In order to ensure that you are revising as many different sections of the novel as possible, avoid quotations or sections of the text which have been used so far in this video. Press pause now to get started. So here's my first quotation. The first speaker is Edward, who is keen to find out how the Dashwoods have adapted to living at Barton Cottage. He asks, "Have you an agreeable neighbourhood here? Are the Middletons pleasant people?" "No, not all," answered Marianne. "We could not be more unfortunately situated." This quotation does make me laugh for a few reasons. On the one hand, we see another example of Marianne not feigning, of saying exactly how she feels. And of course this is refreshing, particularly in a world in which so much of the conversation is somewhat formulaic and dull. Marianne feels that their situation is incredibly unfortunate because they are forever being bothered, forever being railroaded into tedious interactions with the Middletons. But the fact is, my God, they could have been so much more unfortunately situated, both financially and socially. The Middletons and Mrs. Jennings may not be great conversationalists and may irritate with insensitive jokes, but unlike Fanny and even John at Norlands, they do seem to respect and like the Dashwood family. In their own way, they act kindly towards them. Crucially, they are allowing the Dashwoods to maintain gentility by openly embracing them within their community and asking very little in rent. The family may now no longer have a carriage, but they have been able to maintain their own self-respect, something Eleanor appreciates, but which Marianne doesn't. At this stage of the novel, Marianne's immaturity and inability to put her own situation in the context of a ruthless patriarchal world are all too evident. For my second quotation, Edward, Marianne and Eleanor are talking about nature and the ability to adequately do justice to beauty. Marianne declares in chapter 18 of volume 1, "I detest jargon of every kind, and sometimes I've kept my feelings to myself, because I could find no language to describe picturesque beauty, but what was worn out and hackneyed out of all sense and meaning." Once again, we see Marianne's idealism. Her love for nature is so sublime that she would not want to sully or soil, pun intended, her experience by using wholly inadequate vocabulary. Rather than fail to do it justice, she would prefer to say nothing, but continue her intense inward appreciation. Within this context, such principled restraint is arguably admirable, and indeed you can imagine a character such as Darcy in Pride and Prejudice also making a similar stance on avoiding talking garbled rubbish. However, the problem is that Marianne doesn't just apply this maxim to nature, but to a whole range of social situations as well, which, for the sake of social ease and cohesion, require the use of some worn and hackneyed phrases. Most obviously, this is seen in chapter 21 from volume 1, in which Marianne refuses to say anything to Lucy Steele's admittedly irritating inanity. The principle of never saying what you don't feel, or never using language if it may end up being slightly inadequate, can only lead to isolation and a much narrower sphere of influence. There is also an argument that it can take time to find out what people are really like. Susan Morgan, in her essay Polite Lies, the veiled heroine of Sense and Sensibility, seems to imply that some verbal banalities may be necessary in order to allow for the unlocking of more interesting fare later down the line. For my third quotation, we join an insipid evening at the Middletons. But Marianne has a gift. Wrapped up in her own music and her own thoughts, she had by this time forgotten that anybody was in the room beside herself. What we see here is a wonderful lack of self-consciousness present in the midst of highly polished artificiality. Marianne's appreciation of nature, music and the arts are deeply held and within her, so much so that she can close herself in away from the world around her. This is unusual within a society in which female accomplishments were primarily seen as tools to help attract a future partner before being fairly quickly abandoned. To return to Maggie Lane in Jane Austen's worlds. Accomplishments formed an essential part of an upper or middle class woman's education. Their purpose was not to bring pleasure and improvement to herself, though of course that was sometimes the case. Rather, they were embellishments to increase her attractiveness to potential marriage partners and to make her an asset in social gatherings. It is clear from Austen's novels as a whole, including Sense and Sensibility, that she respected those who took their accomplishments seriously. When the dreadful Mrs. Elton talks about her own piano playing in Emma, it is clear that we as readers are intended to deplore her cynical attitude and willingness to abandon something which is genuinely worthwhile. And back in Sense and Sensibility, Lady Middleton has similarly closed her piano lid for good since getting married, an event described with the narrator's characteristically light-hearted ironic tone, suggesting that using music for such cynical purposes is wrong. So although Marianne's tendency to ignore basic social courtesies is implicitly criticised, her genuine talent and feel for music should nonetheless be respected and celebrated. In my fourth quotation, we join a party in London, attended by the great Mrs. Ferrers. The context is that Colonel Brandon has admired some screens painted by Eleanor, only for sycophantic daughter Fanny to change the subject to potential wife to Edward, Miss Morton, and her skill as a painter. Mrs. Ferrers is far more ready to praise not just Miss Morton's painting prowess, but claim that she does everything well. Marianne, indignant and outraged, then cries, "This is admiration of a very particular kind. What is Miss Morton to us? Who knows or who cares for her? It is Eleanor of whom we think and speak." And as readers, we applaud her honesty and shout hooray as the only person prepared to contradict the all-powerful, insufferably haughty matriarch. For whilst Austen does show the importance of politeness and a degree of feigning in order to build ultimately happier social relationships, she also shows her dislike of inhumane snobbery. Indeed, when it comes to choosing between someone who is impulsive, frequently antisocial, but ultimately kind-hearted, and someone who is pompous, overbearing and full of themselves, Austen will always plump for the former. The fact that Marianne subsequently publicly burst into tears after witnessing the female Ferrers' public wounding of Eleanor by such pointed references to Miss Morton suggests not just her own vulnerable emotional state, but her genuine love and loyal care for her sister. Indeed, Rachel Brownstein writes that the ending to the novel suggests that it is the enduring strength of Marianne and Eleanor's relationship which should be celebrated, rather than any of the marriages. For my final quotation, I want to focus on the new, wannabe changed Marianne, who has just returned to Barton. Full of good intentions, she tells a smiling Eleanor, "I mean never to be later in rising than 6. From that time till dinner, I shall divide every moment between music and reading. I form my plan, and am determined to enter on a course of serious study." So in some ways, Marianne has changed. The old Marianne would have whiled away hours and hours walking up and down, reliving the past, and would never have planned anything so ambitious or disciplined. But in other ways, she hasn't. She's still the woman of extremes, still the woman of passionate impulses and desires. What a shame that such a person has to compromise her very self by marrying someone so insistent on sporting flannel waistcoats.
It looks like we've come to the end of this video exploring character within Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility. I hope it's been useful. Many thanks for watching.